Hello, everyone. I have a pleasure of opening the next meeting in the series of seminars that are carried out as part of the new topographies of Nowa Huta project, curated by Łukasz Trciński at Dom Utopii, which is a work based on an extensive artistic and research dialogue led by Simone Rueß and Rafała Mazura, combining a multifaceted reflection and visual analysis of the changing dynamics of movement of the district's inhabitants with the participation of dedicated soundscape of
Hello,
Nowa
Melina.
Huta in the form of...
Melina, do you
Yes?
hear us?
Yes, we can
Because
hear.
we can't hear you.
Okay, I will let know the technical crew that we have a problem. Jamie cannot hear us. Maybe now it will be better. If you could let me know if the problem is solved.
Yeah, now I think we can hear you again.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you. So the project, the new topographies of Nowa Huta, is the project based on the artistic and research dialogue by Simone Rueß and Rafał Mazura. They are researching the changing dynamics of movement of the district's inhabitants with the participation of dedicated soundscape of Nowa Huta in the form of hybrid mapping. And today's event will be about that, about hybrid mapping. But just to narrow down the wider context of today's meeting, New Topographies of Nowa Huta is part of the bigger project of this year's Archeology of Everyday Life, which is curated by the director of Dom Utopii, Małgorzata Szydłowska. It is a series of artistic and research activities touching on the subject of individual and collective memory. Project is implemented within the support of Foundation of Polish-German Cooperation and the Municipality of Kraków. And today we are pleased to host representatives of Berlin-based Collaborative Research Center 1265, Re-Figuration of Spaces. And our speakers are, in alphabetic order, Dr. Jamie Scott Baxter, an architect, planner, and socio-spatial researcher. He coordinates the Planetary Tactics for Cohabitation Living Lab within the Berlin University Alliance project, Rescaling Global Health, Human Health, and Multi-Species Cohabitation on an Urban Planet at the Technical University of Berlin. In this constellation, he jointly coordinates the sub-project Biophilic Urbanisms, Planning with Pathogens. At the intersection of design and science, Jamie engages critical, creative methods to research on, for, and with design and planning. Our second guest is Dr. Séverine Marguin, who is a sociologist and head of the Methods Lab in Collaborative Research Center 1265 at the Technical University of Berlin. She carried out research at the Cluster of Excellence, Image Knowledge Design and Interdisciplinary Laboratory at the Humboldt University of Berlin, and obtained a doctorate in the sociology of work and art at the Leuphana University of Lüneburg and at the School for Advanced Studies in Social Sciences in Paris. Our third guest is Dr. Vivien Sommer, who is a sociologist who researches the complex network of knowledge, space, memory, and communication. And since November 2023, she has begun the junior research group leader of the Emmy Noether Group, the Socio-Spatial Memory of European Borders, Dispositives of Remembering and Forgetting, in the research area Economy and Civil Society at the Leibniz Institute for Research on Society and Space. She's also an associated member of the Collaborative Research Center 1265, already mentioned, at the Technical University of Berlin. All of our three guests are members of the working group Hybrid Mapping Methods, which was funded in September 2018 within the Collaborative Research Center 1265 at the Technical University of Berlin, which consists of young scholars from the field of architecture, urbanism, sociology, and anthropology, and pursues the specific transdisciplinary purpose to investigate and design novel hybrid methods for socio-spatial research. And today we'll be discussing their hybrid mapping methodology. And after our guest's presentation, there will be an opportunity to ask questions. So please feel free to either raise hands or ask your questions in the chat box under the stream. I will monitor that, and whenever there is a question asked online, I will read it out loud so our guests will can hear them. And without further ado, Vivien, Séverine, Jamie, the floor is yours.
Hi, and yeah, thank you, Marlene, for the introductions to the three of us, and thank you to Dom Topi for inviting us to give our talk tonight and sharing our research and our work with you. And thank you to Simone for engaging with us through 3 workshops, which we'll discuss a little bit later. And yeah, so tonight we're going to talk a bit about our method, the hybrid mapping, which we've developed in the SFB research project that Marlene mentioned, which is the Re-Figuration of Spaces. So yeah, we're going to start with a sort of 35-minute presentation and discuss the methods and then reflect a little bit on some of the engagements with Simone. So, over to you, Séverine.
Yeah, so thanks a lot from my side. I hope you can hear me okay, despite my voice. Today we would like to present you a bit what we have been working on in the past years, and we hope that it can be inspirational for the context of that you just presented. So we will, it's quite an, I suppose, quite a usual way to do it. To begin with, giving you a bit of context on this refiguration of space and the way we try to think about the change in society, then presenting you the method that we have been trying to develop within this interdisciplinary constellation that we are forming. And then I will do that, and then I will hand over to Jamie so that he can illustrate what we mean by all this abstract stuff I will present to you, by showing you the project that we're developing for the past 2 or 3 years on Botanical Garden in Berlin. And at the end, we will mention somehow a bit of this work that we had with Simone Rueß and our shared reflection about space, time, and mapping. So what do we mean when we talked about refiguration of spaces? Since the 60s, societies have experienced dramatic shift in their social order. Among the most serious of these changes, and they will be familiar to your ears, there is the intensification of transnational economic activities, the ruptures in global political geography, the development and spread of digital information and communication technologies, the increase in the global circulation of people, knowledge, and good, and the fracture of regional territorial identities. I mean, we could add on to this list. We we consider this dramatic or tectonic shifts in society and social lives, that they have led to a profound change in our experience, understanding, and imagination of space. That is what we call the Re-Figuration of Spaces on a global scale. So that is what we are trying to understand basically by developing this social theory on the Re-Figuration of Spaces. The idea, the assumption is that if we look at the way spaces have been profoundly transformed over the past decades, then we will better understand how societies also are undergoing this social change. So Re-Figuration describes a transformative process that is not attached to a linear or progress-oriented thinking. That is very important. We don't try to understand this in a way of transformation from A to B, but really trying to understand also how it can go circular or go backwards. Because the change is not, and how also change cannot always be for the best, but can be contested, is got to get sideways and so on. So what we are doing within this, with this theory, is really trying to understand or to grasp the conflict and tension produced by very simultaneous and contradictory logic. Okay, that sounds I suppose, very abstract what I'm telling you right now. But for example, imagine that for the past decades, there have been this observation that the world is becoming much more porous and fluid, and that there is actually more or less no borders, and that there is a kind of acceleration in flows and so on. But at the same, and that's probably a good observation for one part of what is going on. But at the same time, there it hasn't been so many borders, fortified borders, that have been built like today. Never in history. So you have like this very two contradictory tendency at work at the same time, like a kind of deterritorialization and re-territorialization, and that's exactly what we are somehow keen trying to grasp with this Re-Figuration theory. That's basically the context of research that brought us together with the artist Simone Rueß, because we were interested, or we are all interested basically in thinking about deeper social spatial transformation. So that's very broad frame in which we are, and that's involved obviously a proper space-time reflection. So how can we imagine somehow how space is changing in time? And before going further, we would like to give you a short definition of what we mean by space-time and space-time. And obviously this quite abstract theoretical introduction is very important for us to, because she's what underlie the method that we've been developing. So what is space? We understand space as relational in the definition of some theorician like Martin Laloux or Doreen Massey. That is, space is not a container. It unfolds through the practice out of an assemblage of different goods and actors. So it's not only an arrangement, it's activated through the action and given meaning through the recognition of this space as such. So that is for us very important, that somehow when we think of space, we think space as multiple, as processual, dynamic, and as multiscalar. Because obviously, today is the talk that we are doing right now is a very good example for this, that obviously we are here in this office, Jamie and I, talking to the computer, basically. You are on the other hand. Our colleague Vivien is in Berlin as well, but in another actually office at the other end of the city, and you are in Krakow, and yeah, no, we can span this like very somehow relational space of interaction between all of us on very like different scale. So what we also working a lot with is to think somehow the multiplicity of space. We use the useful heuristic of spatial figures, and here it's also like let's say a help to not to think space only in form of territory, which would be like this very container, but to think space as a network, as I just did, or as a place when we have like very different relationship to space that are overlapping, or as a trajectory, for example, like a highway, or like, you know, that, and all these are very different. It's for us as a help in order to think the different shapes that space can take. What is time? Here again, we are drawing upon a quite a complex understanding of time that is, as I already mentioned, not only linear, going from A to B, but we are trying to think somehow. I mean, maybe one thought that is important here is that we don't assume that you know, there is somehow the normality or the normal state of thing that is unfolding over the years, but that actually crisis and changes are the normal thing, and that is only when stability comes into it that, as researcher, we began very interested to understand, okay, how this stability comes in. So it's not about trying to understand only crisis and critical juncture as rupture in time, but really much more to understand how time can sometimes get stabilized. And obviously, even if we have like this quite strong chronological embedding, if you want, in the Re-Figuration theory that we think mostly like from the 60s onward. Obviously, we are really trying to reflect on and deconstruct the concept of temporality. So time is not something to take for granted. Time is also constructed, and there is always like, you have to really reflect, okay, why do I use this periodization? Why do I use this event, these stories or stories, and so on? We drew upon the thought of the Indian historian Dipesh Chakrabarti, when, for example, he says, living in the Anthropocene means inhabiting two presents at the same time, the geological time and the human or world history time, to always try to deconstruct in the temporality we think we are in. So, you know, that's, we try to really think space and time through. And yeah, obviously, space-time is about to hold both complexity together. It's difficult and overwhelming, but it's important not to take them for granted. So that was, I mean, that's very short, and I hope not too abstract theoretical introduction. These are the questions that somehow move us, and that's why we thought, in order to be able to understand what is going on empirically, then we need somehow new method to investigate it. That's how we. Sorry, I have to. Use two computer. That's how we, in September, like in 2018, like 5 years ago, we start working together, Jamie, Vivien, and I, with other colleagues, at the Method Lab in the Collaborative Research Center of the Re-Figuration of Space, and where we funded this hybrid mapping method working group. So the main idea was to develop actually new methods for social spatial research and for the refiguration, and at this intersection between sociology, architecture, and planning. So our proposed methodology brings together mappings tool from architecture and planning with methodologies from the social science, or to put it another way, it tries to combine the creativity of spatial design discipline with the reflexive processes of social scientific discipline. Because, yeah, I mean, that was like somehow the first, how do you say that, a consideration that we had, that mapping are very well elaborated and also established tool within the spatial discipline, but they are not that much reflected in a way. We wanted actually to have really to develop a discourse around the mapping method to see how it can help us to investigate what we call the refiguration of spaces. I hope it's okay you hear me. I mean, it's really talking into the computer. We don't see anything. But I suppose I'm just going further. So yeah, maybe a couple of that's my last slide before I hand over to you actually. So with this hybrid mapping method, we try to develop 4 dimensions that are for us fundamental to this method. The first one is this inter and transdisciplinarity. So that explicitly refers to the combination of epistemic and ontological approaches from social science, especially contemporary sociology and anthropology, with spatial design discipline, in particular architecture and planning. So that's what I said about this inter and transdisciplinary work. The second dimension was really this idea to think space on a hybrid way that is actually, as I really is referring to what I just said in the introduction, that basically we don't think only in terms of container or territory, but really trying to think the different, somehow multiple specialities. The third dimension, we call it hybrid data, because we don't want to restrict ourselves to just one type of data, but we really are really keen of thinking the integration of diverse data. That is, could be like textual data, like interviews data, ethnography data, and so on, but also with visual data like photography, mappings, sketches, and so on, or also numerical data, like more quantitative one that we can integrate within the mapping. And the fourth dimension is more about this, how to do it, like the modus operandi that address the diverse methodological approaches existing in each discipline for researching social spatial phenomena. So that is actually combining the more analytical way coming from the sociology with the more designerly way of knowing coming from the design discipline. We will now illustrate this fourth dimension with different mappings produced within the frame of an interdisciplinary research on the Botanical Garden in Berlin, and so show to you how we did it.
Okay, thank you, Séverine. I'm just going to take a peek to see if we can see anybody. No, can't. So, yeah. So yes, Séverine's carefully and wonderfully outlined then the kind of conceptual apparatus which we've used to develop our our methodology, and I think sort of indicated why we need this methodology, why we need this new what we call hybrid mapping methodology. So now we wanted to put this method to the test a little bit, and we developed a project around researching botanic gardens. And there's a number of reasons why we decided to research botanic gardens, but one of the sort of main reasons is that we understand these institutions, which are certainly modern institutions, undergoing some sort of quite significant change over a period of a recent period. Yeah, and we understood this as a kind of a relationship between, so let's say, entering a new epoch that some people talk about as the Anthropocene, perhaps others talk about the planetary or planetary age, and this could be a new epoch, it could be a new time, it could a new context. It's a bit unclear how we, really determine what this is, but what we do sort of know, what we start to agree on, is that it's characterized by this changing relation to the planet and to the other forms of life that exist on this planet. And it's kind of clear that our actions as humans have kind of disturbed these balances and disturbed these kind of life systems. So within this context, one of the sort of more powerful actors that we see as emerging as maybe as a solution to this kind of problem is, especially around sort of climate change and mass species loss, is conservation. And conservation is a kind of as a regime, is something that the botanic gardens are kind of involved with. So on one hand, as this conservation regime changes, so too do these spaces of conservation, which the botanic gardens are a part. So you can see, these kind of core ideas of space and change and temporalities are kind of embedded within this kind of within this case. And of course, this other thing which is important to us is this kind of this more than humanism, this kind of other forms of life that we can investigate within this kind of context. So, we developed some research questions in order to kind of guide us through this this smaller kind of research, and we were concerned with how is space constituted in the botanic gardens in Berlin, and this is so through the hybrid mapping examples that I'm going to show in a minute, we can sort of really start to understand this kind of core question. It seems like a simple question, but I think when we start operationalizing the kind of particular understandings we have of space and of time that Séverine mentioned earlier, then it becomes a little bit more complex. And in which way is knowledge and power inscribed into these spaces? So what are the kind of discourses, what are the kind of discursive practices that are kind of materialized in these spaces? This is a kind of question that we want to address. And in which ways do these spatial structures affect processes of change? So maybe a kind of little, without being too much of a spoiler, we can kind of hint at this idea of conservation. It's perhaps the kind of one of the hypotheses we went into this project with is that conservation is perhaps as a regime or as an institution itself is really there to try and in some ways prevent change, or at least moderate change. It's there to try and preserve and protect and sort of stabilize things. So how does this kind of rub up with the idea that an institution has to change? If we're looking at process of change in a kind of institution or in a regime that is trying to somehow stabilize. So you can see some of these more abstract type ideas that exist at a sort of theoretical level, we could see and we could kind of find ways to search on them through this lens of the Botanic Gardens. So what sort of data did we collect? What sort of data did we collect? Well, hybrid mapping, as Séverine outlined in our sort of, let's say, manifesto, one of the kind of core aspirations of it is to try and bring together different types of data. So in this case, we brought together ethnographic observations such as field notes and texts and photos and sketches. We were able to combine that with expert interviews and go-alongs. And we also were able to access more quantitative data through data banks of plant provenances, which was supplied to us by Botanic Gardens. So the idea was that we could kind of start to try and combine these different data sets in what we call hybrid mapping. So perhaps like just maybe as a point of contrast, you know, we're familiar with maps and mappings, and, you know, perhaps in usual processes, protocols of mapping, maps aim to map changes of space in time. You know, it's quite a kind of linear idea. So like if you look at this slide that's in front of you, you can see underneath it, you can see five images of like a sort of morphology of a botanic garden. This is quite a common way of mapping. So you show on the left sort of 1898, and then you map one by one how the space has kind of evolved through a period of time. So in this case, time is fairly linear, and we're looking at how the sort of materiality of the space has changed. And this is fine, and this is kind of useful technique for mapping certain things, but it doesn't quite get to that kind of complexity that we were kind of striving for. So this is an example now of what we call a hybrid map or hybrid mapping. This was created through a research seminar that Séverine and I ran in 2021, and with students who drew this drawing. And it sort of looks like a kind of quite a complex drawing, and it is a bit of a complex drawing, but over the next few slides I'm going to try and unpack it a little bit and describe, you know, how we put this method to work to try and address some of the questions. So if you remember, one of the core questions that we started with is, how is this spaces constituted? What are these spaces of conservation within the Botanic Gardens? And one of the spaces that we looked at was the glass house, which you can see in sort of the top center of the drawing. And what we try and do is we try and sort of deconstruct that space to understand what the constituent parts are, and then further to understand how maybe structures of power and knowledge are inscribed into the space. Okay. So we identified with our students these kind of 8 dimensions, which are related to climatic zones, old world and new world, taxonomy. You can see these are sort of forms of the way knowledge is organized and dealt with, social institutional networks, educational gestures, and aesthetic practice. Now, they may not be immediately obvious in this drawing, like how do we understand educational gestures through this drawing? I'm going to try and explain a little bit of that now. So the first kind of dimension that we sort of look to understand is about climate and coloniality, geological time and world history. Are we still? Oops.
Yeah, wait. I think I shouldn't have.
Sorry, we're just having a few slide issues here.
Actually, I think it's
this one now.
I'm sorry for this. I somehow we are not really sure what you can see and what we see, so I'm doing it again. I hope now it's fine.
Okay, so what we first thing to understand is what are these glass houses? Well, they're kind of they're mimetic spaces. They mimic a biome from another part of the world. They transport a particular kind of atmosphere, a particular climatic kind of zone, a biome, to, in this case, the global north. Yeah, so this is you know, there's a sort of particular kind of coloniality to this approach, you could say. Well, this is what kind of somehow what we got to in our results, where it was this kind of idea of collecting and not only plants, but sort of going to another place and collecting this biome and replicating it in the north in order to create a space that one could store one's collection of plants within. And this so on the right-hand side of this drawing, you can see that these climatic zones are kind of different according to subtropical, tropical, and they're spread across this kind of glass house. That's the first kind of thing that the first dimension that starts to sort of structure these spaces, is these kind of artificial atmospheres. And this is related to this idea of old world and new world, which, this is related to this idea of old world and new, which is a term which is still used by many botanists today to start to organize the knowledge. This is a way of referring to splitting the world into two parts, and plants that come from the New World, i.e. sort of North and South America, in contrast to plants that, in this case cacti, is what the plants that we were looking at, that come from the Old World. So these ideas, these words, these discourses get kind of reinscribed into space. So you're walking into this kind of big dome, which is glass and feels wonderful, and it's full of plants. But in fact, these plants are organized in such a way that it's very specific, and it's very, it relates to these historic ideas about discovery of Americas, and it relates to this idea of mimicking certain kind of conditions in order to try and allow plants to grow. Now, this may not sound immediately problematic, but somehow these structures become reproduced in more subtle ways as well. So many of the plants, as many of you are aware, have been into botanic gardens, and you'll see the little plaque that's next to them. It gives their Latinized name. This is the taxonomic classification system, which is a way of organizing knowledge, which is very much rooted in the kind of Western European kind of epistemology. And it's fine, it's a very good way of organizing knowledge, but it doesn't have much room for other ways of organizing knowledge, which perhaps don't ascribe to that worldview. And what we found in this case is that, what an artist named Maria-Teresa Albas tried to kind of question this form of presenting knowledge, and even this way of organizing the names and ultimately the plants. And using a different sort of naming process, which came out of a community, the Guarani community in Brazil, where this community go into the forest and they sort of go through a ceremony, and within the ceremony, the plant sort of somehow names itself. There's a whole other set of values and systems of creating a name for a plant. With this artist, Maria-Teresa, she placed these names on the plaques and sort of intervened into the glass house. And this was a very popular art exhibition with the consent of the Botanic Gardens. But at the end of the exhibition, Maria-Teresa offered to allow the gardens to keep the work, but this was kind of gently rejected because they felt that maybe this would be confusing to visitors in the future, where there's this sort of what was described as the real knowledge, the real sort of system of classification, this kind of Eurocentric one, and then this other system, which is more maybe to do with beliefs rather than a real form of knowledge. So this is well, another way of structuration. Another form of structuration. Thanks for whispering in my ear. I think they can hear you. Okay, so I'm going to try and hurry up a little bit because I think we've hit now the 30-minute mark. So a further way of organizing these plants. So we're still in this, walking through this, you have to try and picture this kind of glass house. You're walking through it. There's a little view of that on the left-hand side. You've got these kind of wonderful plants and this warm sort of humid atmosphere, and it feels very wonderful. But now we're starting to sort of see that actually these plants are organized in very particular ways. The ways that they're organized and their names, for example, relate to certain forms of knowledge, certain forms of, certain discourses that are kind of reproduced and repeated in sort of subtle organizational ways. And what we claim is this is the way that the space is kind of constituted through these arrangements. Okay, so another further example of this would be, again, these arrangements, these kind of relationships they're not fluke, the way that these plants have been collected partly through scientific purposes, but they also circulate, plants themselves also circulate on other infrastructures and other sort of networks, such as social and institutional networks. So a lot of exchange happens between the people in another botanic garden, or your past supervisor, or someone you used to work with who's now transferred to another place. And these kind of plants then get circulated around this other network. Yeah, and this is this is not, it's not necessarily saying this is problematic, but one of the kind of results of this is that you kind of end up with a particular collection in one place due to the kind of particular scientist who's collecting, who's the curator at that time. And these become more and more preserved and stratified into this space. Then, further more subtle, sort of finer grained gesture would be this educational gesture, which is about how through making contrast, this arrangement of the plants, it's about communicating learnings and particular kind of forms of knowledge to visitors. So an example of this would be that most of the time old world plants stay in the old world zone and new world plants stay in the new world zone, but perhaps occasionally for an educational purpose, as a new world, an old world succulent might come and sit next to a new world cacti, so that they can make a contrast and to then make a kind of educational point. Finally, what we observed here through these kind of different techniques of go-alongs and interviews and observations, we noticed that the curator, this kind of very subjective kind of level, is also making decisions based on aesthetic kind of ideas about how spaces might be nice to move around for visitors, in contrasting tall plants that look like kind of high rises to low rise plants that look like finer grains of a city. So that it becomes a sort of an interior architecture, as he described it. So the point being is that what seems like a kind of innocent, somehow everyday, well, it's not so everyday, but it seems like a kind of normal, natural, kind of unquestionable sort of an innocent, perhaps even space that you would walk into and it just feels kind of recognizable and comfortable, is also fraught. There's a sort of every position, every assemblage, every kind of organization of the different aspects of this. And we've only now talked about the plants. We've also looked at how the glass house itself is structured through a similar logic. These movements, through these kind of moves, through these structures, certain kind of knowledges are inscribed. So I don't think we've got too much time to talk about the renovation of the glass house.
Maybe it's just, we can show you here. We have we just picked up one mapping that out of the 10, 15, I don't know how many we have now on this project. So it was just for you to get an idea how it is and how we did this mapping, and how much somehow the kind of space-time mapping can tell us about the spatial constitution of one institution. Now, here you can see another mapping that we did about the renovation of the glass houses, or, for example, here about the way somehow the garden, so not only the glass houses, but really the whole garden of Berlin is staged, and with somehow what kind of narrative and motive are behind it.
Maybe the point to make on this is sort of trying to reach back round to where we started about this kind of hypothesis of conservation and how it stratifies spaces in this kind of conflict between the idea of change and stratification. We can kind of see it quite well exampled and well illustrated in this drawing. So the coloured zones in the middle of the drawing are linked to the world map on the right hand side. And this is the Adolf Engler, who was a botanist and early director of the Botanic Gardens. He made a tour of the world in 1900 and 1913, where he started in Germany and moved around through Europe, then I think to Asia, then to North America. And this kind of, he was very struck by this journey, and he wanted to kind of re-perform it a little bit through the garden. So when you go into Berlin Botanic Gardens, you start on the left-hand side in the yellow in Germany, and you walk through Europe, and you go through Asia, and you go through America. And nature, as you can see on this kind of top right view, is very much staged. It's a very scenic kind of idea of what nature, somehow maybe we should put in inverted commas, looks like in these different countries. And it becomes that view, that scene becomes very important, and it becomes important not only for the botanists, let's say in the garden, or those kind of looking after the garden, but it's become important at city level and even beyond that. So actually, it's got layers of protection, conservation protection. Is that this red line that marks it is showing the protected area of the plant geography, and this is significant for a number of reasons, including the history of science, also for its design. So there's a kind of layers of reasons why this should be protected and why this arrangement, these views should all be protected. But this is somehow sits in contrast to, let's say, what's happening with climate change, where temperatures are changing, they're getting a bit warmer in Europe, as we know, or a bit wetter, and that's somehow not good for all of the kind of, say, native species. So we started to see certain trees struggling in the German zone, which have native German trees and protected themselves. But actually, you know, with all these different levels of protection on, from individual trees through to kind of the whole kind of ensemble, it's very difficult to change any of these things, and you know, even when it's necessary. So we start, you know, this is what we sort of see as part of this conservation regime and this kind of stratification of space, even though actually through what we talked about earlier, this idea of the Anthropocene and this kind of changing situation that we're in, we see that there's perhaps really a need to start adapting and changing our practice.
So now we're coming to the end. So that was, I hope you got a bit of an idea what we've been doing, or how we understand how hybrid mapping method. And so basically we had the opportunity to work with Simone over the past months in a series of what we call data sessions. So basically, so when one of us is, in this case, it was Simone coming with her project and then her research question and somehow all the material and documentation that they gathered and so on. And then we are just thinking aloud all together. And it was very enriching to, or it has been like super productive to think further about this transdisciplinary work not only between science and design, but also then with the arts, and where the analytical stop and the artistic, maybe, or synthetic begins, and how this come together, and how it is sometimes also problematic. Or what we found very interesting in these encounters with Simone is that we really, I mean, it was right in the time for us as hybrid mapping, where we really tried to tackle, while we're still doing it, this issue of time. So not only trying to think space on a multiple way, but also time on a multiple way. And as of in the case of the project of Simone, we found it very interesting to reflect on the multiple temporalities or that she encounters while doing this art-based research, and obviously not only on the spatial transformation on Nowej Huty, not only the historical time, as we could call it, but also some biographical time that she was like always when she reported about her dialogue, I mean, or the conversation that she had with the participant that came and drew upon a table that she moved through the city, and not only like this so the historical, the more biographical time, but also like the narration. What do you tell in which somehow order, in a way, when you're telling actually yourself with what do you begin, and so we were really trying to make sense of these different temporalities that are inherent to a lot to the material Simone collected, and try to understand, okay, what does it mean to think time multiple in order to understand the space. Yeah, I think we're coming to the end.
Mm-hmm.
We hope that, I really hope that you could understand me with my whiskey voice. Okay, so we're keen of, really happy to hear your question. The three of us. I mean, Vivien didn't talk, but she would be really happy to answer the question.
Yeah,
Thank you.
you so much for this wonderful presentation. We could hear everything perfectly. We saw everything, so it was really okay. So maybe to start with the questions, since we are indeed talking to computers, do you think the digital dimension of the reality also plays a role in your work, in your research, as maybe another layer of, within the hybrid mapping methodology?
Viv, you want to have a go?
Yeah, I think it plays a role in different ways. So first of all, of course, as a phenomena, maybe you remember in the first part of the presentation, Séverine presented different spatial logics, different spatial figures. So, and one spatial logic is a network, which is like, actually, if you think about network spaces, then most of them are somehow networked through digitization. But of course, also on a level of doing the mapping, digitization plays a huge role in like being able to synthesize different layers of data, for example, in one mapping. So we have digital tools which make it much easier, like to work on them. And maybe also Jamie and Séverine can add something about a new development from the hybrid mapping referring to the metaverse.
Yeah, we did a project over the summer. We could have included a slide on it actually next time. It's too fresh somehow. But we did a project where we with an architect, Constantin Luce, we constructed a 3D digital environment accessible via the browser, when we basically took all the mapping that we did apart. We dismantled them and we actually assembled them together, and to tell like all these small stories that we've been telling through our talk, for example. And we enriched this with some voice, some sound and some videos and so on. So that's a kind of a map that you can walk in if you want. That's it's still in preparation, but it will be accessible, like we hope soon, from our website, from the hybrid mapping website.
Perhaps there's one other point to add to, we've sort of talked about how it plays a role in the mapping and the kind of communication, and how maybe more abstractly it works at a network, but maybe somewhere in the middle of all those things is what we saw as well in the Botanic Gardens, is how digitalization is playing a very big role in this process of change, and it opens interesting questions about, the digitalization, let's say, or the technicalization is happening through the ways that they create knowledge. So there's this kind of, more and more advanced kind of processes of technology and equipment are being used, and kind of get further and further into a sort of microscopic level. So they're looking at sort of genome sequencing and these sort of things. So there's this kind of, there's this technicalization of the scientific production. But then there's also this desire to kind of keep up to date digitally, to try and they have what they call a herbarium, which is where Botanic Gardens have traditionally kind of held samples, dried samples of their plants, and this is really the kind of brain of the operation, and there's this kind of motivation at the moment to digitalize that. In the past, there have been these kind of bunkers that, in the case of Berlin, sit sort of literally underground and store these kind of very delicate pieces of paper with these kind of dried leaves or whatever plant material on them. and the metadata. But now there's this kind of push, not just in Berlin, but in other gardens that we're looking at to scan and digitalize this and store it on the internet and have it open access. And it's a big kind of production, a big push to sort of do that. So digitalization is playing a key role there to sort of pushing them into force, somehow. Yeah.
But from the special perspective, interestingly, there might have like somehow translation of the different structuration what we have been observing within the garden that we actually find again in the organization of the digital infrastructure. So that again, it's not taken for granted that they are like neutral or as it should be, but obviously they are also constructed in a very special way, this platform infrastructure. And that's also part of the research that we're doing on this.
Yeah, to maybe follow up the topic of the temporality and the issue of change or keeping up to date, I would like to ask you about the plan of keeping up to date your maps that are ready final products, right? And adding another layer of the temporality, the future. We saw at one slide that the future sports hall, and in the brackets we had 2030. I know it's in 6-7 years, but do you think or plan on updating it, checking what has been done so far since the project ended?
I mean, that's a very good question. I have to say, I mean, if I may begin, and then guys, you can jump in. But I mean, when we funded hybrid mapping, we were really keen of not thinking of the map as product, but actually of the mapping as a process. And for us, mapping is actually an analytical and interpretative process in order to produce knowledge on, for example, botanical garden. But obviously, it is quite difficult not to get caught with, within the finished product at the end. And for example, I found it really striking this summer when we were trying to do the metaverse, like somehow the reluctance, the implicit reluctance that we had as researcher to touch the mapping and to, take them apart and reassemble them, because it was exactly, and then obviously, as you said, through this much more designy, speculative project of what we call this metaverse or botaniverse or whatever, we managed to conduct a new iteration in our analysis, and it changed the mapping. And that's exactly what you said. It's never finished, right? But yeah, it's not that easy to, I found, to touch them somehow.
Mm.
I just wanted to add, it's like also it has a political dimension. Every research project has funding which is time limited. So there's no never-ending funding for a research project. So I think you're familiar with that too. So I think in the end, you just have to, like, when the map, if you coming to an end with your analysis, you have an outcome, and maybe it's also like when you're writing text or scientific papers about something, it's always the hope that someone is gonna like refer to that work and maybe use the map and do something different, but like, I don't know, reproduce the map and also doing like, actually like bring the map into another time or into the future.
Yeah, so it might be up to somebody else to reflect also on it in time. Jamie,
there's this.
You wanted to say something?
Yeah. I think Yeah, I mean, it's something that, yeah, we're kind of mindful of. And I think there's things that are kind of connected there as well. The digitalization aspect is connected to the kind of temporalities aspect of mapping, which is also then connected to your question of how do these things stay actual, or how do they continue to perform some sort of reality and not get stratified themselves. I mean, so this sort of observation was really what pushed us to start thinking harder about how we not just do mapping of space, but we think more about space-time, because one of the biggest kind of problems, let's say, with the map is this presentation of this thing as stratified, and it presents a space as, and you forget easily that this is just a snapshot of a certain time, and you kind of pore over these maps, and it's very easy to sort of become blind to the fact that it's a complete fallacy. It's just an instant, and it's not even complete in itself. So with that in mind, we were developing this lecture series, Space-Time Matters, where we started to try and think more about how we can include temporalities in mapping, and probably with a view to other digital products and digital processes. And this is a way and this has sort of resulted a little bit in this metaverse experiments that Séverine mentioned. So yeah, this idea of how do we use digital tools, how we go away from just mapping being simply a kind of outline, we include temporalities into it as a way of kind of keeping things updated and allowing them to change themselves.
Yeah, Vivien, you mentioned a political aspect. I understand that a map is used to show a certain section of reality which is based on the spatial knowledge of citizens or people who use given space. And we know that maps are objects of power and always convey certain views of the world, which should be reflected by researchers. But do you think that your methodology could also contribute to making those common spaces, like botanical garden as an example, more accessible to everyone, including, for example, people with disabilities? Also, it's the question about maps themselves as objects, following the rhetoric of mapping as a verb, as a practice, as something inclusive, as something that might play a role into, making reality more accessible.
I mean, I think there is maybe two levels where we can answer. I mean, first of all, obviously the mapping that we are showing, they are like completely impregnated from our positionality, right, as researcher. And that's why we are really trying to reflect upon it and to say that it's just like, obviously it's our interpretation right now of what is going on in the botanical garden. I mean, in close cooperation with the people in the botanical garden, but they might not agree to everything what we just said. I mean, that they are also like, that's our interpretation as researcher about it. Then the idea that somehow mapping could also, the way I understood your question, it would be that mapping could be used in a scientific communication or for scientific communication, for the way we are actually make the quite abstract, complex stuff that we're doing maybe more accessible and available to a broader audience. I mean, I think that is something that we would like to think about. I'm not sure we achieve it right now because our mapping are complex and they are not, in the cartography you are doing this, you can do this distinction between a mapping to read or a mapping to see. So basically there is some mapping that you see them and you understand them immediately, right? obviously we're not doing this kind of mapping. Our mapping are like full of stories that you can and that you can discover. It's really about like, you know, meandering possibly through one mapping for a long time. So yeah, I suppose that somehow the metaverse was also for us a way to think about the accessibility of our work and try to make it a bit more somehow accessible. If we succeed, I'm not sure. Do you want to add something?
Maybe Vivien, you want to have a go?
I was disconnected. I didn't get the question.
Oh no. So yeah, it was about the kind of fallacy or the the fact that maps are representations and present a certain sort of distorted view of the world, I suppose. And
but also the participatory aspect of it.
Well, then there was an aspect about the accessibility and can maps make these spaces more accessible. So I certainly interpreted the question differently to thinking how not is the work accessible to other people, but how do these maps, as you say, that they are powerful, can their power be kind of put to a use to kind of, in fact, be an intervention in the space? That's kind of somehow maybe how I heard the question. That's possibly because I'm coming from architecture and design. It sounds like a design question to me, you know. So yeah, I mean, because then, you know, then we're talking about plans. We're talking about kind of really architectural and urban design drawings, which are then, you know, and there's a whole suite and genre of these things which are about trying to think of the future, and you draw it and you map it and you kind of implement it and you carry out a kind of intervention. Of course, our drawings aren't that. They're very much trying to deconstruct. So they're not trying to present a world as it is somehow. Then they're not trying to present a future world. They're trying to deconstruct a kind of space or a world as it's proposed to be. So there's a slightly different logic in that. If that can be, I mean, it is, maybe you could read it as an intervention in its own right. You know, it's a way of trying to break down that space. And some of our work now is about bringing these kind of maps and these ideas back to gardens and reflecting with the gardens on what some of the results that we found and what the kind of mapping kind of brought to the surface. So, and there is a hope there that through that process, there might be a way to think about now what we might think of as the future of, say, botanic gardens. And that's part of also of our work at the moment, and where we hope to take it a little bit in the future.
But I like to add to you, Jamie, if I think about the deconstructing in the mapping of the botanical garden is super powerful, because it's like actually visualize the critique about how knowledge is produced, like in just like visualizing the different components and putting them back together. I think in the deconstructing this mapping is super powerful, especially in like visualize what you otherwise would like put in words, you know?
Yeah, true. Viv, it sounds like you're saying that drawings are more powerful than words. Is that what I heard?
That's another discussion, right?
My another question refers to maybe that tension as well, because I wonder, how do you negotiate the production of this hybrid knowledge? In other words, like, what is the backstage of your work? Because I can imagine that you have a given space in time with its times in plural, and I wonder, does the space and materiality context determine the ways in which data is collected or produced in terms of drawings, for example, for the map? Or is it the researcher who dives into the space and collects new data, like in grounded theory, basically, in ethnography, and then establish particular, research categories that need to be covered in the later stages of the research. So I wonder, what's the process of negotiation? Is it about the space that generates those this process, or how is it within your team?
That's a good question. Viv, you want to start? I know you love that type of question, Julie.
I think for the process itself, I mean, it's like, as you mentioned in your introduction, we are like, as a hybrid mapping collective, we are mainly a working group who try to reflect on mapping or developing this method and methodology, but we bring in different research projects. So for example, the Botanical Garden was mainly Jamie's and Séverine's research project together with students. And then in our hybrid mapping collective, we're trying to reflect on the mapping process itself. But I would say, like, with my experience on the research process is like the idea of this method and methodology is that you can use the mapping in every stage of your research, like, as you said, at the beginning, when you do mainly data collection and then bring together different data types. For example, you can use the mapping for your first categorization. For example, ground theory, it would be like open coding, like you would start like with first categories, subcategories, and so on. And you can use the mapping for the further stages of the analysis, and then also like discuss that in our hybrid mapping groups through data sessions. For example, I think Simone's work is also a good example because we met 3 times and we met her at different stages in the process, and like we were able to really observe how her mapping developed over this process. So at the beginning, it was a lot about like what kind of data did she collect and why and how. And later on, it was about like very abstract categories which were coming up through the analysis, through the mapping.
I mean, I would add that obviously we are fighting a lot. I mean, it's something that is like, I mean, today we are well behaved because we are like not together and but we do love a good argument and yeah, and we, I mean, and so we are debating like furiously about everything, and I think that's no, I had another thought, but
maybe it was about the sort of one of the dimensions of hybrid mapping is this kind of joint spatial display. Was that what you were going to?
No, actually, no. I mean, I don't think that there is. Sorry. I mean, obviously, everyone is bringing some skills and competence coming from the disciplinary background that we are bringing in, right? But as we are working more and more together, then it's not that Jamie is drawing and we are doing the interviews, it's not that anymore. I mean, that's I manage sometimes even to do some sketches, and you can guide some interviews as well. So I mean that obviously we are becoming much more cross-disciplinary, basically. So running the stuff together.
But maybe, I mean, yeah, perhaps on that as well. I mean, I guess in comparison to, say, a text, which is really hard to collaborate around. I mean, of course, you can do it. You can, Google Docs or whatever it is. You can share a text and you can write it, and there's ways of doing it. But somehow getting around a map, is this kind of joint spatial display, as some of our colleagues refer to it. It becomes, and there's obviously lots of work done on collaborative mapping and participative mapping. And again, we can look at Simone's work, which is, partly about participative mapping as well. So there's a kind of culture of this kind of collective spirit, let's say, or the ability for individuals to collaborate around a map. And I think that, so that is what part of the kind of agenda was within this mapping, how we can work together more collectively within sort of scientific knowledge production.
Maybe and last also, I mean, what we did is it's not just the three of us, but obviously also with a lot of students, because our research in the botanical garden were embedded like in several series of seminars, like 3 seminars over the past 2 years, 2-3 years, and obviously we collaborated. I mean, with 60 students maybe at the total. You know that I mean we credit them obviously each time, but it's also like the way that how we collected the data together, and then they produced the first visualization, and then we go over it, and then so on, and it's iterative, continuous working together on this product of mapping. And then how we, for the metaverse right now, so we just took everything apart again and redraw stuff, and so I suppose it's a lot of hands involved, definitely.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Different hands.
Maybe following that, the topic of the hybrid knowledge and the whole issue around it, because I can imagine that you come with different backgrounds and different skills and different experiences, and I am very tempted to ask about the institutional framework or disciplinary framework for you as researchers embedded into institutional context, such as universities, right? Within the specific disciplines. I wonder if you ever encountered difficulties on your academic paths because of, transcending disciplinary boundaries and participating in the process of this hybrid knowledge, production of hybrid knowledge.
Yes, really good question. And did you just sort of sense that between the three of us? Or no, it's a really good question, and one that we spent about 3 years trying to work on. We did come from our different disciplines, and it took us a long time to sit together quite regularly and be determined to sort of try and overcome and understand each other, understand where we were each coming from. When we said space, I had a certain understanding of space in comparison to these sociologists who had another understanding of space. And, it took us a long time to kind of negotiate and come to terms, by which I mean, develop terms that we could kind of agree on to move forward. So it was a long and part of the process, and it doesn't always work. I mean, there's plenty of examples where where you try and collaborate across disciplines, and somehow you haven't got the time, or the things aren't aligned, and it doesn't work. I don't know if I could say that there's a kind of a formula that one could follow, but certainly in our case, it took time and quite a lot of effort.
But I think there is also like a context, more responding on your institutional question. I mean, the dimension. I think the Berlin is right now quite an interesting place for, let's say, spatial design, urban theory, spatial theory, all these somehow people interested in the transformation of space, of city and so on, coming from different backgrounds, geography, anthropology, sociology, architecture, urban planning and so on. So there is a couple of very big, consortium that are trying to tackle this interdisciplinarity. And the TU Berlin, the technical university where we are, is actually also interesting in this point of view, because it's actually one of the I think the sole and lonely, how do you say that? One and only faculty in Germany where the Institute for Sociology is in the same faculty as the Institute for Architecture and Planning. So it's not the case normally, it's completely separated. But then in Berlin, there, because of some history, don't have to dive into it, like from the 80s onwards, somehow the sociologists are with the spatial planners, and that's obviously that's a massive somehow institutional context. But then I mean, still about if we had any backlash about it, I mean, within the big consortium where we are in, it's very well supported, and it's we are very encouraged to do it. But when we try to bring it back to our discipline, Viv and I, we already tried like several times, you know, with the sociologist, the very like somehow general. I mean, you know, the people are not they're doing mainstream sociology, not only hyperfin, you know, not space, not city, not something like that, like sociology, and they don't understand anything. I mean, it's quite difficult to make it somehow like to make this kind of innovation in method relevant for like I don't know, Viv, do you have any? Do you want to add something?
I mean, I would say, I think it's like, I mean, as Séverine said, based on the institution we are at, for example, right now with my new project, I'm at the IRS, which is actually also an interdisciplinary research institute combining sociologists, geographers, planners, and architecture as well. So it's like, again, an institute which is really like supporting interdisciplinary work. But what we have to do if we go back to like our disciplines is like to do actually translation work. So we're trying to translate the hybrid knowledge we produce to bring back into the disciplinary frame. And I think, I mean, time will show. I think there's interest, especially like in the last 10, 15 years, there's a higher interest in visual methodology and methods. And I think with our mapping approach is like a next step to think about combination of different data types. So I think it's not at all like that there's not an interest, but that you have to do a lot of like translation into your own discipline.
Before I ask another question, I have much more, but I want to remind our audience that you also can ask questions. Please do so in our chat box, and I will read it out loud so that our speakers can respond to it. Following that, I also would like to ask about the flexibility of your method and translating it into different disciplines. I'm thinking even about, I don't know, literary studies. I have an example in mind. We are in Kraków, which has a title of UNESCO City of Literature. And I wonder if it's possible to literary scholars to collaborate with architect, with sociologist or ethnographer to use your methodology to create a tool to, you know, enhance their research, basically. Do you think it's possible to adapt it in different contexts? Vivien is nodding, I think.
I mean, the problem, you know, like with, I mean, I love like also working together with literature studies. The problem is they have a different understanding of methods and methodology. So I think before starting to work together, I think we have to accept that we have different understandings of what is data, what is a method, and so on. But from my perspective, they actually, because we are also working on knowledge and on narratives and on stories. I mean, and I think if you manage to overcome this first step, you know, like formulating a common ground, then I can see very interesting projects through mapping and together with literature studies. I know that there's also like a so-called spatial turn in literature and cultural studies, so who are actually like working with concepts of social spatial theory. And I think like when you start from there, I think you can also adapt this mapping methodology for projects, which are working with different, I would say, data, they would say, maybe cultural products or representations.
Maybe on the just to add that I mean it's not literature studies, but I'm doing right now within the CSC a project with film studies. So we are basically using, I mean it's TV series, and we are using hybrid mapping in order to reconstruct, for example, or just to understand maybe how dwelling, we had like one small project on dwelling practices. So basically how somehow the home is constructed within different series. And there we basically really try to out of all these multiple views that we got on but always fragmented, that we got on the house of the main protagonist of the series. We drew some mapping and we tried to really understand, okay, how is actually the home and this feeling of being home is actually transmitted through the series, and what does it mean? Yeah, so that's definitely completely, that's as Vivien said, we are very much interested also in discourse, stories, narrative. So basically how space is told, and for this to just try to visualize these narratives. That's the mapping is for us a very good tool.
I mean, one concrete example as well might be, how you could use maps to circulate how these products, map how these products are circulating. This is something that we're looking at in other projects as well. So yeah, this would just be a very simple kind of, I think, way of imagining how a map or mapping could be used to trace complex circulations of kind of objects or texts or even ideas,
We are coming to an end of our meeting, but before we wrap up, I would like to ask maybe the last question. If there are no questions in the chat box, so I still can ask my own questions. It's going to be very, very like abstract, or in the way of abstract thinking about transferring academic work into the world outside of academia, outside of grants, research projects with the very long, longevity, basically, because I am aware that, like any academic project, time is required for the research process. But I do wonder if this methodology could serve as sort of ad hoc purpose in places such as those affected by, I don't know, prolonged military conflict, and thus contribute to the documentation, for example, of the, for example, war crimes or ongoing changes in the given fields. I'm obviously thinking about our neighbors and researchers, for example, from Ukraine. And again, I am aware that it is an abstract question, but I do wonder if there is any chance of, going outside of academia and, using this method in a very practical sense.
Maybe I can start. Like, I think, in general, like science communication, like communication with another audience, I think this is an upcoming topic all over like academia, but it's still like not that easy, And I think what why we are so like inspired by Simone's work is also this aspect, because like, you know, art and art-based research is always not only about like a smaller audience like academia is still focused on. And I think for us, one inspiring path is to think about, like, in cooperation with artists like Simone, to think about how we can adapt our mapping to a wider audience or different audience, I would say, and also like, how to not only like analyzing the world, but also like, you know, help to change it.
I mean, I found the question also very interesting, and obviously we were just discussing right now. The first thing that come to mind is forensic architecture and the work of A.L. Weizmann and so on. I think that I mean, I'm not sure. I think that I see a difference, but maybe we don't agree. Here again, the fight. I think that there is a kind of very attention in our work to we're not trying to somehow map the reality as it is, as forensic is doing on a very impressive way, and I'm quite fond of their work, but there is another, I think, starting hypothesis in what we are doing, that there is a kind of there is always a multiple perspective on a different object, being so difficult as a war conflict, and so basically it's trying through maybe the method of mapping is to bring into relation these different perspectives, and it's still we come back to this fact that it's still through our glasses, through our own glasses, the people that are producing the map, you know. I mean, it will never be like a kind of completely like having all these multiple positionalities within, but yeah, I think that I see much more for me, somehow the fascination that I have about mapping is that through this associative way of doing it, you know, you can bring very different stuff together. Then it's a first step into coming closer to this multi-perspective. It doesn't mean that there is no relativistic, I mean, we shouldn't fall into the trap of relativity into this, and just because the one are thinking this and this one, then everything is relative, and I don't mean that. I really mean it to like more, you know, there is no objectivity and it shouldn't be any relativity, but there is like maybe something like relationality, and that's maybe the mapping is a tool for it, because it's breaking with the linearity where you always have to structure in a very hierarchic way the first and then the second and the third and so on. And the mapping is much more horizontal and maybe allow for this encounter between different positions. It was a very abstract answer to your very abstract question.
Maybe to try and like situate it a little bit. I mean, I agree. I think it was a good answer as well, actually, both of them. But maybe, you know, one of the ways that we're operationalizing maps in other projects, which are less about research and more about, you know, kind of action, let's say. And it's about using the maps not only to somehow map relationalities, but also to build relationalities and to build relations, you know, over big distances. And I think that's a kind of powerful tool and a powerful possibility of some of these maps.
Thank you so much. I promised it was the last question, and I think we will stop here. Thank you so much for both presentation and taking part in the discussion. We've learned a lot. It was very, very insightful. I checked, there are no comments still, so I didn't overlook anything. Using this opportunity, I would like to invite everybody for tomorrow. We start also at 5 p.m. We will meet with Simone Rueß, Rafał Mazur, and Tomasz Padło, and we will talk about their project. I think I, for sure, will also bring some issues from our today's discussion and presentation. And I would like to cordially invite you to join us tomorrow. You can find all the details both on the Facebook page of Utopia Home, as well as on the Utopia Home web page. But for now, thank you again, Vivien Sommer, Jamie Scott Baxter, Séverine Marguin. Thank you so much.
Thank
Thank you as
you.
well.
Thank you.
Thank you
was
so much.
wonderful moderation. Thanks a lot.